How did China grow its economy in double digits for several decades? Part 1. The economic growth of China, and the death of Mao Zedong, are directly related. Mao Zedong was a strict socialist, and a steadfast believer of distribution of wealth. Anybody who showed signs of extraordinary skills or talent, was pushed out of the system, due to the fear that these talented people will get too much influence or control. The communist agenda was to stifle creativity, follow uniformity, and never let anyone become rich or powerful. The death of Mao allowed the Chinese economy to come out of the strict socialism and state control, which were based on the rigid principles of Mao, until then. The successor of Mao was Deng Xiaoping. When he saw the destruction of lives, poverty, and lack of development, due to the socialistic policies under Mao, he became a pragmatist, and not a socialist Puritan. Deng used to be the main leader, who was involved in the brutal anti-rightist campaign, under Mao, during the 1960s. So, he was by no means a capitalist, or a moderate candidate. But, fortunately for him and China, Deng had the sense to see what was happening to his country, and could change his beliefs. One of the first items on Deng Xiaoping's agenda was to improve the economy of China, and truly modernize its industries. Like every other grand vision in China, there was a name given to this goal of Deng Xiaoping, and was called, Four Modernizations. 2 foreign trips of Deng changed the course of China, and their economic trajectory. About 2 years after Mao's death, Deng visited Japan on an official goodwill visit. Japan had officially recognized the People's Republic of China in 1972. And despite a dispute in 1978, China's relations with Japan were normalizing, and trade had started growing. But, Deng's trip on October was a complete game changer, and the person who made it happen was Konosuke Matsushita, the founder of Panasonic, earlier known as Matsushita Electric. Deng Xiaoping was a master craftsman, who charmed Matsushita with his curiosity and interest with Japanese technology, and asked Matsushita, if he will help him, to modernize China. Matsushita was very impressed with Deng's humility, and was the first person to set up the manufacturing base in China. As they say, the rest was history, and of course, we'll cover every bit of that history in this video. In a couple of months after Deng's visit to China, Masayoshi Oira became the Prime Minister of Japan, and he turned out to be the closest friend of China ever, helping Japan set up their manufacturing and technology base in China. The second important visit of Deng Xiaoping was to Singapore. The founding father of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was the Prime Minister of Singapore. He was once a believer of communism, but had turned into a capitalist, and a totalitarian, with absolute power in Singapore. Lee was the architect of the modernization of Singapore, from a fishing village into a global city. Lee Kuan Yew gave a warm welcome to Deng Xiaoping. That was the first meeting between Deng and Lee. Lee Kuan Yew was an ethnic Chinese and had a high regard towards his heritage. He had a natural inclination to help China grow. Lee Kuan Yew genuinely believed that the Chinese race was gifted with special skills. When Deng showed admiration with the Singapore model, Lee responded, if the Singaporean Chinese, who were descendants of illiterate peasants of Guangdong and Fujian, can do it, the Mandarin literati of mainland China are far more qualified to do even better. Lee later traveled to China 33 times to help China. One other famous advice given by Lee Kuan Yew was, if China created special economic zones, then the foreign corporates, filled with greed and motivated by profits, will take care of the rest, including building the infrastructure. Deng was really surprised about this, but Li was right. The cheap labor and the lax regulations helped the corporates all over the world to flock to China in the next few years, transforming China totally. The Shenzhen experiment. Shenzhen, a sleepy fisherman town, very close to Hong Kong and its port, was chosen as the first city for this experiment of capitalism in China. It became one of the special economic zones in China. The fishermen, workers and some peasants, were driven out and the land was used by the Japanese, Americans and the rest of the corporations. Deng created more special economic zones, apart from open coastal cities, the economic and technology development zones, the Delta Open Zones, the Peninsula Open Zones, the Open Border Cities, and the High-Tech Industry Development Zones. The foreign companies built the infrastructure for their own benefit, which then helped Shenzhen to become a modern city. The progress was slow initially, but the pace picked up soon as more and more companies saw the benefits of the reduced costs and started moving in large numbers. Shenzhen later became the Silicon Valley for hardware, especially telecommunication equipments, and its related networking hardware. The chain reaction, and the explosion of money. There were three elements to the growth of China throughout this miraculous growth period. First, the companies needed real estate for their factories as well as housing for their workers. There was indirect need for real estate as well, for shops and other businesses and services, which catered to these new workers. In 1958, the land reform and its related laws brought by Mao and the CCP, abolished private ownership, and households all over China were organized into state-operated communes. So, nobody can buy land in mainland China, but can only purchase a land use right, which gives the permission to build a building on top of the land. So, the land is always owned by the government, even if the building is owned by the private owner. This land use right, which works like a lease, is given for 70 years for civilian residence, 50 years for industrial use, and 40 years for commercial land. The fee for this lease is paid to the government and varies based on what the CCP chooses it to be. The foreign companies created an explosion for the demand for real estate. The local governments got money for leasing the land, and the banks were set up to lend money. Due to the infrastructure improvement, and the foreign companies setting up their factories, more people moved to the city, needing more residential and commercial space. This made real estate developers reap huge profits, leading to more real estate development. Guess what? They had to lease more land from the government for a higher and higher price, and borrow money from the banks, creating wealth for all the three entities. The Chinese people now got to work in higher paying jobs than as a peasant or a fisherman, leading to economic prosperity. There were so many foreign and Chinese entrepreneurs working very hard to achieve economic prosperity. The Chinese government encouraged private investments in every possible way. The foreign companies also were getting windfall profits due to availability of cheap labor. So, everyone seemed to be happy with this symbiotic relationship. Money, and CCP's influence, a match made in heaven. This was an ideal scenario for the Chinese government. They are now firmly seated in power, and are claiming their place in the international arena. The Chinese government helped the Western companies with their ease of getting all approvals with very less or no hassle. The environmental degradation and health hazards of the Chinese workers and their living environment were largely ignored. The regulations were eased and any protest was crushed. So, this new model of the Western capitalism, being part of the autocratic communist China, was extremely convenient for all parties involved. The mega projects. Since the Chinese government collected a lot of money, in several billions of dollars, they could focus on further infrastructure development, and long-term needs, like electricity generation, irrigation, and construction of dams. CCP had shown great interest in coming up with mega projects, like the Three Gorges Dam, South to North Water Diversion Project, the high-speed railway network, even to remote locations, and many other projects. Apart from the fact that these projects gave the CCP, and China, an international recognition, it also provided opportunities for huge corruption for CCP officials. These projects are so outlandishly huge, that it has never been tried anywhere in the world, allowing the Communist Party the bragging rights of being pioneers. Moreover, the enormous expenditure helped huge employment opportunities for the average Chinese, and improvement in his or her life. Double-digit growth. Since the economic base was so low, and the impact of the interruption was so large, the growth was easily maintained in double digits, in the first decade, and more. The average growth from 1981 to 1990 was roughly around 10%. This is almost impossible, if not for the perfect storm or a combination of the Western capitalism and greed, along with the availability of Chinese labor, land and non-existent regulations. The CCP could acquire land very cheaply, and quickly, for the corporations to set up their base. Because the CCP could vacate the existing residents, with a very short notice. The Chinese courts always favored the Chinese government, because there was only one party, namely the CCP, which controlled the entire government machinery, military, economy, judiciary, internal security, healthcare and all forms of power. So, the Chinese government and the foreign company can choose the land of their choice, and can vacate anybody at will. This also was in line with the original Confucian theory, sacrificing self for the family for the community, and community for the emperor, or the country, either willingly or unwillingly. In these cases, forcing the resident out was mostly done unwillingly. Hypocrisy of the West, and its media. The world press was mesmerized with the miracle growth of China's economy. The CCP tried their best to please them with their deception and pretense. The foreign press was wary to bring any adverse news to the fore, either. With their respective governments supporting the Chinese, the foreign press was more than willing to look the other way of any suppression or torture of any organized group. The Western governments were sensitive to any displeasure expressed by the CCP. Atrocities committed on Falun Gong members, or the democratic movements were covered more as a social disturbance, than oppression. With nobody interested in questioning the CCP, it crushed any social group that CCP felt threatened, as well as freedom of speech, with imprisonment or worse. The Chinese government could do no wrong, and if they did, there was not a single government or media in the world which was willing to highlight it in a serious manner. Everybody was part of this gravy train ride of increase in wealth. Money was the only thing that mattered to both the consumer and the producer. Unfair trade policies of China. On top of all these, China introduced one other additional element, which destroyed the business competitiveness totally, around the globe. The huge revenues the Chinese government were making by leasing the land and in other forms of taxation, were helpful in providing incentives and financial support to the businesses. The incentives were so high that the products manufactured in China could be sold at such extremely low prices that no other country could compete with China. Manufacturing units around the world could never keep up with the prices offered by the Chinese, that the competing countries closed down their units totally and moved to China. The inimitable Chinese model. The price pressure exerted by the Chinese was so intense that if any other government tried to follow the Chinese model, the Chinese will outdo them further, sometimes leading to heavy losses to China for a short period of time, until their competitor ran out of business. The unethical and unfair business practices followed by China were a clear violation of international norms, but the capitalistic countries were not too bothered by them, so long the profits kept soaring. Thanks for watching.